Welcome to Vote Chat, brought to you by the Department of Politics at Otago University. I'm Carlini. We're here today before a live audience and we're also live streaming, so welcome to everyone. As always, you can put your questions to our guests today via Twitter, and here's Nicole to explain how you can do that.
Thank you, Del. So welcome to the Twitter desk. We've dedicated part of the show to those of you who are watching us live. Throughout the show, we'll be taking questions asked on Twitter and putting them to Mr. Dunne. To ask one of these questions, simply log on to Twitter, form your question, and direct it to our Twitter handle, @OUVoteChat. Or alternatively, you can use the hashtag VoteChat14. Today we'll be discussing policy issues leading up to the election, and so we welcome your questions on these. I'll now hand you back to Del, who will check in with us here at the Twitter desk throughout the show.
Thanks, Nicole. We're here today talking with the leader of the United Future Party, who is also the Minister of Internal Affairs, the Associate Minister of Conservation and the Associate Minister of Health, Peter Dunne. Welcome.
Hi, Del. Nice to be here.
You've been in politics for 30 years.
Yes, it doesn't seem that long when you sort of think back over it, but when you say 30 years, it seems like a lifetime.
Vote Chat is a student project where questions are put by students, coming up to around the upcoming election, and a lot of them wouldn't have been born when you went into Parliament in 1984. You came in with the Longy government, and I read somewhere recently that you talked about a lot of that was a reaction, or your influence in politics at that time was a reaction to something you called Muldoonism. Explain that to us.
Well, yes, for a lot of people, Sir Robert Muldoon is a figure of history. But if I just give you a couple of examples and then just say one or two things more generally. In 1984, you could only take, I think it was $4,000 out of the country with the Reserve Bank's approval if you were going on an overseas trip. The government controlled interest rates on mortgages. In 1984, we had strict controls on foreign exchange. There were a whole range of things. Shops didn't open beyond Saturday. So it was a very controlled and different society. And it was the tail end, really, of a period in our history. The guys that went away and fought World War II were getting towards retirement age, and most of them were in the Muldoon cabinet. So you had this generational shift to a government led by Longy, a 41-year-old. Most of the ministers were in their 30s and early 40s and had none of that baggage of those pre-war or of that post-war period, and just wanted to get on and open things up and get on with making the country make progress.
So I want to walk through each of those successive governments that you've been part of. But before we do, you studied political science yourself, didn't you? Yes,
I did. I did a master's at Canterbury.
Why? Why political science?
Oh, because I did a double... my first degree was a double degree in history and politics, and I've always been interested in politics, even from a very young age. I don't come from a very political family, although both my grandparents on one side and my great-grandparents on another side were politically involved, but my parents, no, I still don't know which way they voted, and they've been dead for many years. So I just had this thing that I wanted to be in politics. If it wasn't for that, I'd have probably gone to sea.
Right. So, I've heard you say before that it was about the age of 14 when you were you found politics, when most young men are finding girls.
Yes, I found politics. I found politics in a very strange way. I discovered, well, by that stage, I guess I was more than just showing a passing interest. I used to sort of late at night, when most people would listen to other things on the radio, listen to Parliament on the radio. And then I discovered that you could get, if you wrote to your MP, Hansard, the parliamentary debates that used to be produced in a weekly version, a little pink booklet, sent to you. And so I got my MP to send me those books, and he did. And when he lost his seat many, many years later, his successor sent them. By that stage, I was an MP myself. My mother was still getting these things sent to her for this confounded son of hers.
So you've been in politics a long time before you were actually...
I've been interested. And then I went to university, and as you say, I studied politics. I was involved in student politics. I was president of the Students' Association at Canterbury. So I guess I was, I was in politics really from my very early years.
OK, so let's quickly go through. You came in with the 84 Longy government. David Longy was Prime Minister. What was that experience like for you?
That was liberating because, as I said before, it was not just a change of government, it was a whole change of attitude, and watching a whole lot of, I guess, previously sacred cows get slain was quite a fascinating experience. And being being part of that government that for its first 3 years seemed to have the Midas touch. Everything it did turned to gold, and it did some outrageous things in terms of the New Zealand society we knew, broke all the rules, removed controls, took subsidies off farmers, etc., floated the dollar, opened the country up in a way that no one could ever have imagined. And the government seemed to be able to get it right every time. Won a landslide victory in 1987, and then the share market crash came along, and then the government started to basically forget about fighting the opposition. It fought itself for 3 years and tore itself apart.
So it was a period of ugliness within the Labour Party.
It was a massive... The Labour Party's quite good at internal division, but this was internal division par excellence. And it was summed up for me at one stage by a Tom Scott cartoon. We had at one stage the police and farmers, who are a very unlikely coalition, marching on Parliament in protest at the same time. The police have never marched on Parliament, but they did. They marched, they came in, the farmers came in, and the whole of Parliament grounds was filled with this rather unlikely group. Tom Scott did a cartoon the following day of all these people protesting at Parliament grounds. The top of the beehive was on fire, there was smoke coming out of it, all sorts of things. And this voice was saying, "Will you people down there shut up? We're trying to run a country up here." And that sort of summed up really what it was about. We were, and I was part of that, we were too busy fighting each other. And it got to the ridiculous stage where people would say, "I saw you talking to so-and-so the other day, you know, one of your colleagues. What were you talking about?" Because they were trying to work out whose side. Were you on the Longy side or were you on the Douglas side?
So Longy resigned.
Longy resigned in the end in 1989.
And your relationship changed with him?
Oh, I'd never had a particularly good relationship with him, although, funnily enough, for some quite extraneous reasons, in the last 2 or 3 years before he died, we patched things up and were on reasonably good terms.
So then we go into the Palmer Prime Minister, and then more.
And I was a very strong supporter of Geoffrey Palmer's. He's a friend of mine. I've got a huge regard for him. I think in a different time he'd have been a very good MMP Prime Minister, but he was inheriting the ship that was sinking. And he was dumped by the Labour Party, or he chose to walk away, but effectively they were dumping him about 8 weeks before the 1990 election, because the Labour Party caucus felt that Mike Moore was a better bet not to win the election, that had long since been given away, but to save Labour seats. In the end, I think he actually cost Labour 2 seats rather than saved any. And then he was the leader of the opposition for 3 years, from 90 to 93. I found that a very uncomfortable period because Moore was all over the show, basically, and was trying to recapture the spirit of the 1930s Labour Party, not necessarily the policies, but the sort of, keep hope alive, we're here fighting for our people. I don't know who our people are to this day. And it just seemed to me that this was Labour that had a chance in the 80s to have established itself as the natural party of government, being progressive, modern and forward-looking, was retrenching to type. And with MMP looming on the horizon, remember we had the first referendum at the 1993 election, which indicated that people wanted to move to MMP by 96. I decided it was time to actually start to think about where I wanted to go long term. And I came fairly quickly to the conclusion that the more Labour Party, followed on by the more social democratic Helen Clark Labour Party, were not where I wanted to be. So that started the journey that led me. Initially, I had a brief period as an independent, then a group of us, National and Labour MPs, got together and formed the United Party, which over time became the United Future Party. That formation took place in 1995. And I've sort of stayed the course since.
So we're into the Bolger years?
Yep. And in 1996, at the beginning of 1996, United, which had 7 MPs, the Bolger government didn't have a majority in Parliament, or had a very fragile majority, and United and National formed a coalition before the 1996 election. So it was our first coalition government since the wartime.
MMP coalitions.
And I became Minister of Internal Affairs and Minister of Revenue in that government. And that lasted through until the 96 election. I had never had a great deal to do with Jim Bolger until around that time. I became then, and remain today, a very strong admirer of him. I think he was a very underrated New Zealand Prime Minister. He had a sense of nationhood and purpose that perhaps the only other person in my lifetime would have sort of been in the same camp was Norman Kirk, actually. Bolger had a big vision about New Zealand. I don't think it was shared by all his colleagues or even understood by most of them. but he was a far greater figure than I think he's given credit for. And I remain, I think, on pretty good terms with him today. And we went through that transition. As it turned out, the 96 election produced that appalling coalition with New Zealand First. And I sort of spent 3 years between 96 and 99. I wasn't part of the government, but I was sort of like first cab off the rank. And when New Zealand First was dumped from the coalition, when about the time Jenny Shipley became Prime Minister, or just after that, then obviously my vote became more important. The government changed in 99. I had 3 years then totally in opposition, and that was very frustrating as a sole person in opposition. And then in 2002, United Future won 7 seats and entered into a confidence and supply agreement with Labour, which we lasted 6 years with, by which stage we'd dwindled down, and in 2008, when National came in, we won only 1 seat, but we were pivotal to getting National over the line in a confidence and supply agreement then, and that's been continued through right to this day.
So Clark and then Key.
Yep.
And just tell me about those two people and the relationships you have with those.
Oh, they're both very different. I've got a very high regard for both for different reasons. Helen Clark is extremely focused and process-driven and driven generally. When I was exiting from the Labour Party, she was the leader of the Labour Party at that time. She was actually the one person that I could confide my intentions in and know I would not be betrayed. And she had every reason to betray me. I mean, why would she want to hang on to someone who was saying, I'm planning to leave? But she was very, I was going to say encouraging. I don't mean that in the sense of yes, out the door, but sort of, give you time, work it through. And she never betrayed the confidence. And I respect her hugely for that. I think she was a remarkable Prime Minister. John Key is a different kettle of fish altogether. I mean, I think he is a great Prime Minister, but he's all the things that Helen's not. He's focused, but in a different way. He's focused on where he's going to be rather than on the process. I always say to people, the difference between Helen Clark and John Key would be to say, look, you've got to go, Peter, you've got to go to Dunedin for this vote chat on Friday. Now, it's at 1 o'clock, you've got to be there. Key would say, and if you're not, I'll have you. You've let me down, that's it. Clark would say, now how are you going to get there? I'm going to get the such and such a flight. Or do you think you should fly, or do you think you should go by bus? Let me know when when the ferry leaves, all that sort of thing. Whereas Key trusts people to actually honour the commitment. So where's your personality in that? If describe your person, are you more Clark or more Key? I'm a little bit of both. I'm quite good. That's a very centrist answer. Yeah, well, it is, but it's true. I'm quite good at process, and I do like to cross T's and dot I's and make sure that everyone else does that. On the other hand, I am extremely, to put it politely, stubborn. I don't really like being told what to do, which is probably why I didn't work in a major party. And so the key notion of here's the objective, go and achieve it, suits me quite nicely. But I want to make sure that I tick all the boxes along the way. Okay. I just want to talk to you about strategy for a second. Because on one hand, you could say you would be possibly one of the best strategists in MMP if we look at the fact that of your 30 years in Parliament, 20-ish have been in cabinet positions. Not quite, but not far off that. In various ways. And you've done that with both parties twice. So, and that's something that other parties haven't been able to achieve. So that's one part of the equation, is the successful strategy. The other side of the equation is there's the United Future party, but is United Future Peter Dunne? Yep. Or is you're the only one left standing? Yeah. So is that a failed strategy in the sense that people are not getting your message? Well, people aren't getting the message, obviously, or if they are getting it, they're not liking it. That's the reality that you've got to conclude from the figures. On the other hand, as you say, being able to work with successive governments now for more than 20 years and achieve things within the context of both of those governments that are important to me and to United Future is a plus. I think the difficulty is this. We have a proportional system that allows for a much greater expression of political view. But if you go back beyond that to the last stages of first past the post, National and Labour had become very broad churches. They often overlapped. And all MMP did was make the various coalitions within those parties more explicit. I mean, when I left the Labour Party, I can see people in that Labour Party who went on to join New Zealand First, ACT, the Greens, National, and then I can see people in the National Party who went to ACT, one or two that went to the Greens, a few that went to New Zealand First. So in other words, this overlapping thing. When you take a liberal centrist party like United Future, it sort of, it doesn't quite fit in between the two. You see, one of the things that I find people often say to me is, well, you've worked with both, you've been there, whose side are you really on? You know, are you really a Nat or are you really Labour? And I say, well, I'm neither. And they can't cope with that because our culture has always had this one side or the other of the line. And the person that says, and I think there are a lot of New Zealanders who are like this, but because of culture, they don't express it politically, that actually I like this bit of what this side of the line is offering and this bit of what that side of the line is offering. Doesn't quite fit. I mean, my political philosophy is very, very simple. I am a classic, I don't mean in the libertarian sense, but a classic liberal, probably in the old Whig sense from the 18th, 19th century. I believe very strongly in the freedom of individuals, a huge commitment to human rights. I believe very strongly in open markets, free trade, and a laissez-faire approach to the economy. But I also believe that because of my belief in individuals, the state has a role in their health, their education, their welfare, their protection through the police and defence, etc. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position. But in the New Zealand context, if I believe in open market economies, I should therefore believe in privatising the health system, privatising the education system and so forth. If I believe on the other side of the coin in the state accepting a role in health, education and welfare, I should also believe in the state controlling the means of distribution, production and exchange. And our system seems unable to delineate the fact that people don't live their lives in those boxes. People do live between them. But when it comes to politics, you know, it's the old James K. Baxter line from the Ballad of Every Street, where two old souls go quietly go quietly mad, national mum and Labour dad. I think that's still ingrained in the New Zealand psyche, unfortunately.
So your centrist position should have been the group to carve out a middle ground that hasn't been able to be achieved.
And that's what we frankly expected. When we formed the United Party back in 1995, and we had, as I say, there were 3 ex-Labour and 4 ex-National MPs in that group. That's what we really thought we were doing, and that we would be, like the Free Democrats in Germany up until the last election, the party that was the permanent party of government, because no one could govern without you. Culturally, if you looked at the European proportional representation systems, they all required a centrist, liberal-tending party to make the system work. So we just assumed that in New Zealand, because we're basically the same sort of background, that would happen. But it hasn't, and I think it's for the reasons that I described, that we've come from still a pretty polarised left versus right, or soft left, soft right division, and that the political parties have tended to camp one side or other of the line. You've got on the left at the moment, you look at the, in no particular order, Labour, the Mana Internet, the Greens, New Zealand First because it's none of the above party. On the right you've got, you'd say, National, ACT, United Future, possibly the Maori Party. And they're probably very unfair descriptions of all of them, but that's the way we tend to divide them. And I think that's been to our cost.
And is the MMP system hard on small parties in the terms of they lose their differentiation, their positioning, their identity once they go into some sort of agreement?
It's proven to be. Again, counter to a lot of the political science, if you like, beforehand, the small parties in governing arrangements get blamed for everything the government does which is unpopular, but they never get thanked for everything the government does which is popular.
Now this is a comment in today's news for Sue Mulroney, I think.
Well, that's a very good example. She's got it wrong, but the argument is exactly that point, that my vote was the vote that tipped Labour's paid parental leave bill over the line. I supported it. And I supported it because United Future would actually go for 12 months paid parental leave, not 6. So we felt Mulroney was only going halfway, but we support her as better than not. Now, she is claiming that because I wouldn't support an opposition tactic on a previous bill, I think related to handheld lasers or something or other, that I've somehow sunk her bill. My point is her bill would never have got to the stage of even being debated in Parliament were it not for my support. My support on it is unwavering, but it's a classic. I'm blamed because her bill's not proceeding. I'm not thanked for having got it to that point. David Clark's Mondayisation of Anzac Day bill, which I also supported, you wouldn't know that. It got through on my vote. This is a great triumph for David Clark and the Labour Party. They're very good at claiming the credit when it suits them, and then when it doesn't suit them, I'm the problem.
So what have you achieved in 30 years? What are the high points for you? What can you, hand on heart, say, I made the difference by being here in these 30 years?
Well, I'll give you one. It's one of a number, but I'll give you two, actually. But the changes that we made to both the business tax system under Labour in 2007 and to the personal tax system in 2010 under National, I was Minister of Revenue in both governments, I take particular credit for. And if you read both budgets, the 2007 budget, Michael Cullen gives me the credit for the business tax changes in that. And in the 2010 budget, Bill English gives me the credit for the personal tax changes.
What was the outcome for businesses?
Well, the outcome was that we cut business taxes down to 28 cents, and the outcome in the personal tax case was that we cut tax rates across the board. And I'm very proud of both of those achievements. I'm proud also of having established under Labour in 2004 the Families Commission, which despite assaults from all quarters remains and is now being lauded by the present government as being a very important part of the social policy structure. I'm proud of things we've done during this term. We introduced a Game Animal Council to give greater recognition to the rights of and the interests and the role really of recreational hunters in terms of managing the game resource, both from a pest management point of view on some sides, but also from managing that as an industry that people actually quite like to participate in and enjoy. So there's a number of things that I can put my hand on and say, that was my doing. I've been very critical in the last year because of the way it's behaved of the Electoral Commission. I have to acknowledge that in 1993, I was the driving force behind its establishment. I introduced a private members' bill to Parliament in 1991 called the Information Privacy Bill. It was the biggest members' bill ever introduced. It was massive, and it became the Privacy Act.
Now, you mentioned there in the first example there, it was around the Families Commission. And families, if I reading your philosophies, early philosophies, families feature very strongly.
Well, they do, because well, we all come from a family. We're all part of a family. Families come in many shapes and sizes. I don't believe in one size fits all in terms of the definition. But they're the building block of, firstly, our neighbourhoods, our suburbs, our towns, our cities, our country. So when you've got good, strong, functioning families and a really good commitment to families, it seems to me to follow that the rest also improves. It's really interesting. I remember when, about the 2002 election, we decided to make families a really important part of our campaign. And a number of the advertising agencies that we consulted said, don't go there, don't go there. That's a very divisive topic. You don't want to even mention the word. And we decided they were wrong, and the rest is history. But when I look at all the government literature at that time, there's no reference to families at all. And the reason wasn't that they were anti-family, it was because they couldn't quite work out how to describe a family. So because your circumstances might differ from mine, might differ from the next person's, best not go there. Just not mention it, pretend that they don't exist. Once we put it on the agenda, every party became family friendly. We've had family affairs spokespeople, we've had family policies, family packages, it's now redolent in the language. And I'm quite proud in a way of that, although I'm a bit annoyed that they all stole a good idea. But
which is politics.
Yes, of course it is, and I'm quite proud that it still endures.
After all of these years, what are the fundamentals you've learned about politics? The working of politics in this country. What have you, the absolute core of your learning? This
may sound a bit trite, but it's the numbers. If you ain't got the numbers, you're not going anywhere. And so what I've learned is that it's about building coalitions of support for policies. It's about recognising that no one person or party has the absolute answer, but between them the various shades of grey might form the answer that becomes at least a workable proposition moving forward. What I've learned is that you can be very secure, very self-contained in the sense of being internally consistent, and stick to your philosophy and your core values and remain forever in opposition, a voice on the sidelines shouting sort of in despair. Or you can be prepared to engage, work through, negotiate, do the occasional deal, be prepared to tolerate things that you mightn't otherwise have thought you might tolerate in the interests of making a greater gain. And I've come to the conclusion, both personally and politically, that in the interests of the country and what you want to achieve, it's far better to be in the latter camp than forever a voice in the wilderness in the former.
Yeah, so that's always the argument, is it to stay outside, which I think is the Maori Party, Honi Harawira ideas. The Maori Party decided that they could actually do more from inside the camp, and he decided that actually didn't want to compromise what he believed. So
well,
there's lots of examples.
I think you've got to be realistic. If you're a small party going from here to, and just be silly, going from here to Christchurch might be unattainable. But getting to Ashburton might be quite a good start. And you might be able to take people with you as far as the Ashburton leg of the journey, but not the final leg. But if you're actually, at that point you're only 50k or whatever it is from your target. Far closer than if you're sitting in Dunedin all the time. And I guess that's my approach. This is incremental. Let's make progress here. Let's see this one lead to the other. The classic I mentioned before. When I started talking with Helen about tax reform in 2006-07, it was very clear that personal tax rates were off Labor's agenda. And I said, but if we move in the business front, which he was quite happy to do, and we create a situation where you have a gap of potentially 10 cents or more in the top tax rate and the company rate, you're going to encourage people to shift and make themselves companies to pay less tax. Yep, we're just not going there. We're not going there. And I thought, okay, fine, I'll accept this as stage one. And then when a different government came along, I knew I could work then on stage two. If I'd decided back in 2006-07, it was all or nothing, I think I know what would have won, and I'd have been pretty unhappy.
So it's a kaizen, it's incremental steps.
It is, yeah, and it's saying, okay, let's just push this as far as we can and see what happens. And sometimes you're quite surprised. One of the other things that I did back then was I wanted to increase the tax rebate available to people who made charitable donations. It used to be, I think it was $600 and something. And we did some work about it and found, I wanted to get it up to 5,000, which I thought was more realistic. We actually did some work and we found that there was no valid case for having any restriction. So now every single donation that people make to charity is tax deductible.
Right.
And it was only because we started pushing that you suddenly realise that the door opens, there's a lot more you can do. I guess I can think of other examples where you just start out doing something, just giving it a gentle nudge, and then suddenly other possibilities open up.
Okay, so let's turn to this election. What is going to be the character of this election? What are going to be the issues that you see this election is going to be fought on, and what's United Future going to do?
Well, I think in terms of the big picture, I don't see this as a change election. So the issues now are about how is the economic recovery impacting upon New Zealanders? What are the distributional effects in terms of the benefits for households, for individuals in terms of employment, of the transition that we've been through post the GFC? I think that at the political level, you're going to see, you've got on the one side, I think Key will portray himself as leading a stable, progressive government that has in United Future, ACT and the Maori Party reliable partners, and we can move forward, versus a pretty divided left, Labour, Greens, Harawira, New Zealand First possibly.
I'll just interrupt you there. We'll come back to that. Nicole, I believe there's something happening on Twitter.
Yeah, we've got a very fitting question given that we are live streaming from the University of Otago. Jonathan Hampton's tweeted in, and he wants to know your stance on interest-free loans for students.
Well, we would actually turn the whole thing on its head. I think that what I'd like to do in an ideal world is to abolish student fees altogether and use student allowances and a little bit of a government contribution to pay for those. So in other words, you'd have no student allowances, you'd have no fees, students would still be able to borrow for living costs. Now, if you think that through, you might think, oh, that sounds pretty draconian. But actually what it does is it means that there would be no discrepancy between a student doing a bachelor's degree or a medicine or engineering, because the living costs are the issue, not the fees. It also means that you are in a better place to control fees, because if you take the funding on the one side from student allowances plus a government contribution as being the balance here, then the total sum of fees imposed could only balance there. So there'd be big pressure on the tertiary institutions to control their fees and to make sure that students weren't being ripped off. So I think that's the way of doing it, because at the moment you've got a massive, I used to know these figures off by heart when I was Minister of Revenue, a massive debt burden. You've got, we've made huge progress over the years in trying to get students to repay, but you've still got a big lump of people who you either can't locate or who won't repay. And you've got people who are going to be facing a debt burden for a very long period of time. So I think it's time to actually change the goalposts. And the type of approach that I've outlined is radical, but I think it's achievable and would certainly mean that students would end up with a far more modest loan to have to repay, and it would be far more manageable.
This election, just a point there before we go on. Twitter, all of the social media, what impact is that having on
Oh, huge.
On politics?
I mean, I'm someone who's known to more than occasionally frequent Twitter, and I find it fascinating, infuriating at times, because you get this huge outrage that builds up over things that you say, and you think, oh God, I've really upset the apple cart today, and then you find it's maybe a dozen people. But then you get your Twitter stats for the week come in, and I discovered that last week I had a total reach to people of just under 16,000. Now you think, where else in politics can you talk to that number of people in a week? You know, so that's the other side. So it's a question of how you communicate, how you interact. And I think that all of us are still learning just what that means in reality, what that means in terms of not just the political discourse, but also the nature of the way you do your job. If you're communicating instantly to people, then does that change the nature of decisions governments have to make? Because governments have quite laboured processes for making policy changes, quite an established set of processes. Well, you know, is that going to mean that all of those come under challenge now for a much more instant response? I think that's the big sort of unknown from all of this. Or do we just have a more engaged and open public and a more lively interchange of ideas along the way?
Speaking of instant responses, we've got another Twitter question that's come in. Nicole.
Yeah, so Baden Harris has tweeted in reference to Mulroney's bill that we were discussing earlier. He'd like to know whether you'll ask the government to fund it. Baden
actually tweeted me on this 2 nights ago, and I gave him the same answer then that I'll give him now. I actually did, at the time the bill was first proposed, I actually said to the government, why don't you go for 12 months? Baden seems to think that somehow I've got the power to just wave a magic wand and John Key says yes sir, no sir. And they chose not to. Do I support 12 months paid parental leave, or 6 months as in this case? Certainly I support 12 months, and I think it's a matter of how you work to get it. But Baden, you've asked the question now 3 times, and I've given you the same answer 3 times. I'm sorry about the value of consistency.
Immigration is an issue. I see Labor's started to beat a drum there. There's Winston Peters is back on that one. Is it going to be a feature of this election?
I fear it's going to be a feature in a very negative way. I think what you're going to see, and I've even seen signs of this within National, of everyone wanting to beat the immigration drum to some extent.
What's driving that?
Oh, I think it's some of the prejudice in some cases. In the New Zealand First case, it's blatant racism. That's the Ku Klux Klan in drag, these guys. And we shouldn't beat around the bush there. I mean, Winston always plays the race card when he thinks he needs votes. I think some of the pressures in Auckland around housing, which are actually, when you look at the numbers, don't justify some of the claims being made, are leading to some of this argument about immigration being a problem. I thought the most bizarre comment of all was David Cunliffe's, who said that the problem with immigration at the moment was too many New Zealanders were returning home. That's inflating the numbers. Let me just say very quickly where United Future stands, because I think we've got a different approach to any other party. And I won't go through the whole detail, but just two things that we would do, which are anathema to everyone else. We'd actually increase the refugee quota from 750 to 1,000 people per year. And we'd introduce a new visa category called a retirement visa, which would enable the elderly parents of New Zealand residents to relocate to New Zealand.
Why?
Why? Because if you go back to the ethos of family, it seems fair and just to enable families, particularly in the twilight years of people's lives, to be together. And the idea that Winston has of this sort of racist rubbish that they're all coming here because they've only got to be here 10 years and they qualify for superannuation and this is sort of the easiest route around, is just arrant nonsense, because most of these people are at a stage in their lives where they're probably not going to live 10 years. Most of them are at a stage in their lives where they've got family in New Zealand who will be prepared to support them. But the idea that the immigration system arbitrarily prevents that happening, I just think is repugnant and unjust.
Another Twitter question, Nicole.
Yes, Vote Left 14 has tweeted in asking about the legalisation of marijuana and how if we can restrict the supply of alcohol and drugs, why the same cannot be applied to marijuana. Well,
I think it's really about horses that have bolted from stables. And I think the argument that says, well, you've let tobacco, you've let alcohol out on the loose, why can't you let marijuana out on the loose, I think is a bit fatuous. Because it's a bit of a case of if we knew then what we know now, we may not have actually let the first two out of the stable and the first go off. And simply saying, well, therefore, we'll let the third one go, I think is wrong. Having said that, the Psychoactive Substances Act regime of providing for the testing of products to prove that they are low risk before they're allowed on the market might actually in the longer term give us a way through the cannabis issue. I'm not saying, as some choose to hear me say, that means that I'm really saying, well, once we get this up in place, cannabis will be tested and it'll come through and it'll be right, because all the evidence I've seen suggests that cannabis probably wouldn't pass a testing regime because it's still got very severe adverse effects. And so I think it's just a matter of being quite steady and quite focused in our approach. We are reviewing the Misuse of Drugs Act, and cannabis comes under that. And there'll be legislation in the House during the next parliamentary term. I think that looking at the evidence that's around, I mean, it's fascinating to me that there was this huge uproar around psychoactive substances and synthetic cannabinoids. And on the one hand, which I understand, on the other people were saying, but if you just let the real stuff through, you wouldn't have the same problem. Well, you mightn't have that problem. You'd have problems elsewhere in all of the emergency rooms, the National Poisons Centre, the Centre for Adverse Reaction to Medicines, etc. All of those people who specialise in this area, the police would tell you that.
Okay. Now, you've had an interesting year because we've had the GCSB debacle, we've had the deregistration of your party, and we've had the whole issue around legal highs and the to's and fro's of that. Just address those issues one at a time. GCSB.
Well, I was caught up in a maelstrom of circumstantial evidence at best and malicious rumour and gossip at worst. And it was an interesting experience to have to go through when you realise you're in the middle of something that you can't actually control the outcome of, and that you just have to get through as best you can. It happened a week after United Future was deregistered because of duplicity by the Electoral Commission, which actually told us what we should do, and then when we did it, deregistered us. We'd gone to the Electoral Commission to say, look, every party has to submit each year a statutory declaration that it has 500 members. They never check it. We actually went to them and said, we think we have problems verifying some of our members. Can you give us a bit of time just to sort it through? And they said, oh, yeah, okay. And we went back to them and said, we need another month. And they then said, look, the best way through this is, because we don't have the discretion, is give us a letter saying that you would offer to deregister while you sorted this out, and we will use it if we need to. We did, and the next thing we got a letter from them saying, thank you, we've deregistered you.
And the legal highs?
And the legal highs, well, the reason that I decided in, when was it, just before Easter, that we needed to move more rapidly was quite simple. If you go back to the legal highs regime that was put in place last year, it's effectively said that from the time that the legislation was passed, all products went off the shelves until they went through the testing process. For pragmatic reasons, there were around, ultimately ended up at around 35 products that had been on the shelves for some time, not known to be the cause of any problems, deemed to be relatively low risk, that we said these can actually stick around until the new testing regime comes in, then they will have to come off. At that point, I think we imagined that new regime would take weeks, a few months at best to bring in place. It's actually taken a lot longer, and it's not yet complete because it's turned out to be a more complex problem. In the meantime, we had a huge moral hysteria build up around these products. And I came to the conclusion that since they were going to go anyway, once the new regime was in place, it was probably better to take them off now rather than to carry on with this sort of quite outrageous set of arguments that were being run. We had mayors who were shirking their responsibilities in terms of their councils developing their local area policies. They insisted that we were imposing them upon us. The Dunedin City Council led the charge in submitting to Parliament that they actually wanted to have these powers. So when Parliament gave them the powers, they turned around and said, oh God, here you are dumping more stuff on us. It's exactly the same rules as they have for regulating alcohol. They don't leap up and down about that. So they were the first group. You had all these extraordinary claims about the thousands of addicts out there who were going to be let loose on the public health system if we took these substances away. And I kept saying, based on the advice that I was receiving, that we thought the figure was probably nearer to 200. Do you know what the actual figures turned out to be? It's probably nearer to 150. So a huge hype. And in the end, I thought, this is silly. We are in danger here of this whole thing getting out of control. So that was why I took the steps in, as I say, around Easter in late April to just remove those existing products. But the idea that we've brought in a ban, or that we've turned the regime on its head, or that we've done away with the regime, are all rubbish. All we've done is take away those interim products.
We've got a couple of minutes left. There's another Twitter question, I believe, Nicole.
Yes, Keely Shaw would like to know your thoughts on abortion law reform.
I think that the matter of abortion is really one between the woman concerned and her doctor, and I think the decision should be based on the informed consent of the person seeking the abortion.
Right. Would you decriminalise it?
That's an interesting question. Personally, I would probably tend in that direction. I'm not absolutely sure, though, that that's the right way to go, but on the face of it, I think if you come back and say, look, provided the decision is reached between the woman and her doctor and based on informed consent, that is about, the limit of it. Mm-hmm. So that does raise the issue of whether you want to continue to retain a criminal sanction. As I say, my inclinations tend in that direction, but I'm just not 100% certain. If
we were sitting here and, in next election time, and you look back and said, it's been good, well, what's happened in this last election in terms of what United Future or you have been able to do, with a minute to go, what would you say needs to happen? What do you need to do to convince an electorate that election it's worth having in Parliament? Well,
I'd say two things. Firstly, I'd want to look back and say we have introduced Flexi Super, which gives people more choice about when they take up their super. So a discounted rate if you go early, from the age of 60, an increased rate if you defer till 70. More choice over your retirement, not being told by the state you've got to retire at a certain stage. I'd also want to say that we've changed the way in which we approach recreational interests, particularly recreational fishing, and that the right of the million-odd New Zealanders who like to get out and enjoy the great outdoors to catch a reasonable daily bag limit of recreational fish has been made paramount and isn't subject always to commercial considerations. At the moment, the commercial sector gets its cut and then the recreationist gets what's left over. I'd want to turn that around. So if, in 3 years' time, coming before you again, I'd like to be able to say, I said those things, I ticked them off, we've done them.
Very good. I think we're out of time. Thanks to our guest, Peter Dunne, the Honourable Peter Dunne. Next week, we will be talking to Vikram Kumar, who's the Chief Executive of the Internet Party. As always, you can view this interview and previous interviews on VoteChat by going to our YouTube channel, OU VoteChat. I hope you join us next week at the same time. Good afternoon.